Announcing a massive victory for PETA. After a 31-month campaign, Harvard has now lost millions of dollars used in the torture of monkeys. And now PETA is calling on Harvard to send the monkeys to a reputable sanctuary. Harvard's in the news for a lot these days, but the closure of the torture labs of Margaret Livingstone was broadly supported by scientists and the public. We don't want that news to get lost. To give you a full picture of what the closure of the Livingstone labs at Harvard means, we reprise this episode on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, Dr. Margaret Livingstone at Harvard continues new research where she deprives monkeys of their vision for curiosity's sake. Her findings have little to no relevance to humans, but she keeps getting millions in federal grants anyway. The grants, the bad science, tortured monkeys, most of whom are killed after the experiment, and then the cycle begins again. New grants, more dead monkeys. Dr. Catherine Rowe, a former NIH researcher and now a PETA scientist, says that's the way the system works. But it doesn't have to be that way. Dr. Rowe says most young scientists feel trapped and are forced to believe in a failed science model. In my conversation with Dr. Rowe, she outlines what changes can be made and how you can stop the experimenters. On this edition of the PETA Podcast, Dr. Rowe begins by talking about how she avoided becoming a vivisector herself.
It was honestly just luck. So I'll date myself, but back in the early 90s when I was an undergraduate, so many years ago, I made the choice to pursue graduate school. I decided that I wanted to be a biomedical researcher as opposed to going into medical school. Those were sort of the two things I was choosing between. So when I decided I did want to become a researcher, my advisor at the time said, well, you've got the grades and everything, but you need research experience. Like if you want to get into graduate school, the most important prerequisite is having conducted research as an undergraduate. So you need to go work with somebody in a lab. And he asked me, what are you interested in? And I gave him the answer I had at the time at, 19, which was I'm interested in the brain. And he said, okay. There's this one person who would be perfect for you. He does brain research with monkeys. He said, oh, you know what though? He's retiring. So, you should go work with this other woman who does research with humans. And so that's what I did.
Just like that, on a whim almost, or the convenience factor of this guy's not going to be around, but she's going to be around. That's how you decide.
That's how it was decided. And it wasn't even really decided by me. I, at that time, at that age, would have done whatever they told me to do. So if they said, go and work with this monkey experimenter, I would have done it. And it's something I talk about with my colleagues a lot because I reflect on that. I think to myself, had that person not been retiring, or had they decided, if the next choice on the list was another vivisector, would I be currently working in a monkey lab? Would I have the same perspective I do now, which is that this is morally unacceptable and scientifically problematic? Or would I be, somebody who PETA was trying to shut down?
Do you think about that a lot?
I really do. I mean, it's part of my job. I do a lot of things with PETA. One of them is making sure that the public is aware of how very invasive experiments are and how very limited they are in terms of translating into human treatments or cures. But the other thing that I try to do is convince people who are working with animals, who are experimenting on animals, to transition away, to point out to them how ethically problematic what they're doing is. And we see time after time that people who are experimenting on animals won't entertain that possibility at all. And so that mindset that like locked in mindset of, no, what I'm doing is important, what I'm doing is okay, has to get built, right? Like that has been built up in them over years. And I have to wonder, would that have happened to me? Would I have questioned what I was doing if I was experimenting on animals? And would I have convinced myself, in order to get my research experience and get into grad school and then get my, all of the hoops that you have to go through to be part of the scientific community, would I have convinced myself that it was okay?
And tell me about your contemporaries, other students who are in the same situation and maybe didn't have the kind of thing happen to them as you. I mean, it was clear you're going to go with the clinical person because the monkey experimenter was retiring. What if the choice had not been that way for others? And did they go down that other path?
They would, and a lot of people do. I mean, the choice is, again, the younger you are in your research career, meaning if you're an undergraduate or a grad student, you don't have that many choices, right? It's not the case that every laboratory is open to you and that you're going to have the opportunity to work in any lab you choose. You're going to have the opportunity to work in a lab that has a position open, that is interested in you. And so you often have that choice made for you. And so I consider myself lucky that I wasn't assigned basically to a lab that uses animals, because I think a lot of people find themselves in that position and never, ever escape it, even if they think that they might, even if they think that, oh, I'll just do this for my undergraduate research, or I'll just do this for my degree. Once you start accumulating that type of experience, so let's say vivisection experience, or working with mice, or working with monkeys, or zebrafish, or birds, whatever it is, that's your background now. And so somebody who's working with humans isn't going to hire somebody whose past experiences with mice. And so you get locked in from a very, very early stage in your career. And that early stage is basically, the roll of a dice. You could end up doing really, really human relevant, ethically sane research with humans, or you could end up doing some of the absolute worst vivisection we've ever seen. And you won't have had a choice when that choice was made for you.
So what percentage of these young researchers or researchers in their career would you say get trapped?
I would say, I don't have a percentage calculated for you, but I would say it was the majority of people. Because again, you work in the lab, you get assigned to, I think you're told, especially if you're working with animals, especially if you're new to working with animals, that this is important. You have to do it. And you convince yourself of that. I mean, if you spent all day decapitating rats, which is what a lot of young experimenters have to do, you would have to tell yourself over and over again, well, I'm going to help humans one day. I'm going to help humans one day. So I think a lot of people get trapped. I think it's really only the elite, maybe the top 10% of scientists, and I'll use that term, who are ambitious enough and thoughtful enough to say, what I'm doing here isn't working, or I'm not comfortable with it ethically, and I'm not going to do it. I think that is the minority of people.
You may not have a choice though, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, you always have a choice. I don't want to suggest that somebody who's working in an animal lab can't get out. They can, but it's going to be effortful. It's going to be a challenge. It shouldn't be. It should absolutely be acceptable for anybody to say, I don't want to experiment on animals, but I do want to go into science and medicine. What is the path that I can take? But that is a very taboo position to take. And again, the younger you are, the more easily suppressed you would be, right? If a bunch of scientists at your university say, you can't be opposed to animal experimentation. We do animal, you're not going to be a good scientist if you think about the ethics of this. And people believe it, because these are authority figures. These are people they respect. These are people who have had success in the industry. So yeah, I think there is always a choice. And we do have people who who absolutely say, I'm not going to do it. But I think that they are the minority.
And it takes a certain courage. You
It
have
does.
to go up against the establishment, and essentially you are a heretic, right?
Yes, it is. It is absolutely considered your persona non grata if you are willing to say that something that's so ingrained in the establishment is unacceptable, and you have to be brave. I mean, we talk about sometimes, I'm sure most people, I'm sure you are familiar, but probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with the experiments of Stanley Milgram, who was interested to see how people could be convinced to harm other people. And he brought people into the lab and he told them that they were going to shock other human beings, and as part of a scientific inquiry. And fortunately, no people were actually shocked. I can't say that for animals who are shocked in labs, but many, many people, like 90% of the people who we brought into the lab, were willing to shock their fellow human beings because they were told it was for science. And I do think this is what happens to a lot of the undergraduates who go into a lab and somebody's there with a red coat and says, you need to shock these mice, or you need to shock these monkeys, or you need to cut the heads off of these animals for science. And I think probably a similar percentage of people that Stanley Milgram saw who went along with it for humans would go along with it for animals. And it's only this very, very small percentage of people who say, hey, wait a second, wait. I'm not okay with this, and walk out.
It's almost as if you question, it's like you question your act or your right to question, and you go along. And so there's a belief in the science that is so strong that it ends up being your mindset. You have to adopt it. And it's almost like a kind of culty.
It is. I think that's right. I think that is. And the willingness to conform, right? The willingness to go along with the group. In the Milgram experiments, he had conditions where he had an individual come in and they had to decide by themselves alone whether they would shock people and how high a level of shock they would administer to these humans who were actually Confederates. They weren't actually being shocked, but they were screaming, right? So the person who was administering the shock absolutely believed that they were shocking people and hurting them because they could hear them screaming in the other room. Alone, acting as an individual versus you sitting there with 4 other people. And so Stanley Milgram set it up so that the 4 other people who were in the room were like, sure, I'll shock it. And so the people were even more likely to do it if everybody around them was comfortable. And again, that is the laboratory environment. If you're brought into an animal laboratory, everybody there is handling the animals. They're injecting the animals. They're experimenting on the animals. You know what I mean? This is now your group. And to say, I'm not comfortable with this, I don't think this is okay, is not conforming. And most people will conform.
Well, what does that say about the validity of the science when everyone's in this group mentality? How does it affect or impact the science and the credibility of the science? Is it even science at that point if people are manipulated? Because that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that at least as far as science based on animal experimentation, we already know that so much of that data that comes from non-human species isn't applicable to humans. We know this. I mean, there are thousands of papers documenting differences in species, failures of new drugs and treatments that tested safe and effective in animals, but then fail in human trials. We know that the animal-based science is problematic, but people continue to do it. It's also not what science is supposed to be, right? Science is supposed to be a continuously evolving, continuously seeking out the newest, greatest, most accurate, most innovative methods, but that's not the reality, unfortunately. The reality is people do what they're told, people do what's socially acceptable, and people do what they have been convinced is the best way for career advancement. And so, the science, I always say that people tend to put scientists on pedestals because we've gone to school for some X number of years, which we did. But scientists are just like anybody else. They have to worry about paying the rent. They have to worry about paying for their kids' braces. They have to worry about keeping their job. And that means they need to keep the grant money coming in, and they need to keep the papers published, and they need to keep. Scientists are just as flawed as anybody in any career path. They're just as likely to gloss over something. They're just as likely to make mistakes as anybody else. And we need to take scientists off that pedestal because it's a mistake.
The crazy thing to me is if they know it's wrong and they continue to do it, it is this crazy exercise, sort of like, almost like, to bring up the cliche about Einstein, right? The definition of insanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
They keep doing it over. And we're no closer to cures. We're no closer to real scientific breakthroughs because it's really bad science. We're just doing an exercise. We're doing an exercise in not science, but careerism or something like that.
Yeah. It's again, it's you have to jump through all of these hoops, and you have to, meet these certain criteria. And somewhere along the way, and I don't think any scientist or medical professional thinks this is what they're going to be doing when they start out. I think most people are ambitious, but they're ambitious towards really contributing to the field, meaning they're going to develop new treatments or cures for humans, or they're going to acquire extremely important new knowledge. But what happens, as we see again in most fields, is that the need to meet certain criteria that have nothing to do with how innovative your science is, that have nothing to do with how beneficial your research is to either the field or to human health, but rather, did you get enough publications? Were they in a high impact journal? How much money from the federal government are you able to bring in? How many students have you pushed through? All of these yardsticks, all of these milestones that you have to meet have little to do with the quality of your science, and more to do with your ability to do the business of science.
Right.
Which are two different things.
Right. The business of science. Well, it just makes me wonder that all this effort and all this work for generations has created almost like a parallel sub-science of, hey, here's this thing and it looks like science but it hasn't created any breakthroughs, but
Mm-hmm.
it is the exercise so our scientific minds are active. Meanwhile, in this real world of science, where we're trying to find breakthroughs and trying to find solutions, we haven't advanced at all. Or when we have, it's not because of the efforts of the subscience, where they know that you can't cross species, you can't, you fail doing. They're the exercise of science versus real science, the breakthrough part. And that's kind of like right. The dual world. Now, we have generations, though, like you pointed out when you were an undergrad. You're still much younger than many people. The point is, by now, we must have a new generation of scientists who say, look, we're done with this sub-science parallel universe kind of thing. We need to work in the real world with real people where there are applications where we can have breakthroughs. There's got to be some movement where those guys are winning versus the other guys.
I certainly hope so. The thing that an obstacle we face is that all of those next generation scientists are being trained by last generation scientists who were trained by the generation before them scientists. So what we see all too often is that an experimenter, say, we can use me as a hypothetical example. It didn't happen this way, but it could have. I go into a monkey lab when I'm 19 and I start experimenting on monkeys. So then I graduate and I go to a grad school where they have a monkey lab, and I spend 6 years working on a PhD in monkeys. Then I go and do a postdoc, and then I have faculty. Now I've got my own students, and I'm teaching them how to experiment on monkeys. And and we see this. I mean, we see this time and time again. We have experimenters active now who are in their 70s experimenting on non-human primates who were trained by people who experimented on non-human primates and who are putting other experimenters out there who will now only know how to experiment on non-human primates. So I would say it was a gift that keeps on giving, but it's not a gift. It's a self-perpetuating nightmare for the animals because it just breeds more people who are willing to do this, even though it is ethically problematic and even though it is scientifically flawed.
Well, it's also a waste of resources, a waste of time. If you know you're just doing this, like I said, you're in this parallel universe where you're acting like scientists, but you know that aren't there? I mean, people could say, to put a positive spin, well, this is not totally wasteful because we see how these things work, and maybe an ounce of this can be used in the real world with real people to get real solutions. But is that pertinent, or does that ever really happen, or is all of that science using the animals totally worthless?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. So for a long time, before a lot of the new technologies that are available now were available, it was hard to look inside the human body. And so a lot of the earlier experiments with animals got more details about basic physiology, right? Things that are comparable from one species to another. But the reality we're facing now in terms of medical advancements is that we've basically tapped all of the species similarities that we can. And it's those differences that are what we need to understand and move away from in order to get at, how do human diseases develop? How are human diseases best treated? How are human diseases best cured? But again, the average scientist isn't looking for a new treatment or a cure for humans. They're just curious about physiology. Or it doesn't have to be physiology, but people who are working in biomedical research tend to be very curious about how the owl brain works, or how the monkey brain works, or how the rat, gastrointestinal system works. And the fact that it's not ever going to translate into something you or I can benefit from is irrelevant to them.
Right. I mean, and I guess that's really the point. I mean, who are we to put a kibosh on curiosity? Curiosity should be that should be a great thing, that we are curious about monkeys and animals. And I mean that would be a
curiosity causes as much pain and suffering as the curiosity that a lot of these animal experiments are trying to satiate, right? Yeah. I'm all for curiosity. In fact, all of the research that I did with humans was curiosity-based research. It wasn't going to have a direct impact on human health. It was what was classified as basic science research. So somebody could hold me up to a microscope and say, you didn't cure any humans with the 20 plus years that you did with your research either. That's true. You know what else I didn't do? I didn't kill a bunch of animals, right? I didn't harm anybody. I just answered interesting questions about the human brain. I can accept that curiosity-driven research has a value, but does it have a value that's high enough to compensate for the extraordinary amount of suffering that these experiments tend to inflict on other animals? And my answer to that is, unabashedly no.
Well, also the breach of ethics, right? The breach of common humanity, or a sense of humanity, a sense of the humane.
Well, what you see too often, and it's something that frustrates me more than I care to admit, but it really does frustrate me, is that people who are doing these curiosity-driven experiments on animals, these extremely invasive experiments on animals, often deadly experiments on animals, when questioned about the ethics, like how do you justify? They'll then immediately pivot to the new cures and treatments for humans. Like, we've got people suffering with Alzheimer's disease, and even though their research has absolutely nothing to do with cancer or sepsis or neuropsychiatric diseases, it's just curiosity-driven research, but they will justify it to the public by saying, but we need to have this information. And people believe it because, again, they hear somebody who's a scientist at Harvard or Johns Hopkins or at NIH and assume, well, they wouldn't say that it was going to benefit me if it wasn't. Yes, they would.
Yeah.
Yes, they would. And they do all the time.
White coat intimidation is what it is. And it's almost like from the gods, right? The science from the gods, and they are the gods.
And again, they are as flawed as anybody else.
Yeah.
They have the same expectations they need to meet.
Yeah.
So don't assume that somebody in a white coat has any more gravitas. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not above it all, certainly.
No, they're not.
Well, let's look at one specifically. Let's talk about Margaret Livingstone at Harvard. She has been on the radar among PETA scientists as doing the wrong kind of science for years. But now there are these new strobe experiments on monkeys. I mean, I had to understand this, and I thought it was like strobe lights. They're flashing lights like at a disco with these monkeys. No, it's not. It's not funny. It's real, but it's not lights. But what is the strobe effect that she's simulating with the monkeys?
Oh, this is a nightmare. So this is just for listeners. This is the same experimenter who PETA exposed as having taken baby monkeys away from their mothers, and in some experiments sewing the baby's eyes shut for up to a year. But we recently got new documents from the NIH that tell us that in addition to, sometimes sewing baby monkeys' eyes shut for a year, she is now forcing these newborn infant monkeys to wear these specially made goggles that basically create a strobe-like effect. So when you say like a disco, that's the effect that they're having. They're basically wearing goggles that have shutters that open and close at a really rapid rate. So they're having light and then dark and then light and then dark over and over and over again all day for a year and a half. So these baby monkeys taken away from their mothers, which we already know is like a disaster for them. Monkeys who are taken away from their mothers, like humans, and don't have normal physical contact with their mothers, have all kinds of psychopathology just from that, just from not being allowed to stay with their mothers as they would in nature. And now these experimenters at Harvard are forcing these monkeys to be having lights flashing on and off, or darkness flashing on and off, if that's easier for people to understand. But just turn the lights on and off in your house for 5 minutes and see how annoying that is. And then imagine living like that for a year and a half, just so that they can see, what does that do to the monkey's brains? Nothing good. That's the answer. Nothing good.
Is there anything specifically they could say that these monkeys were exposed? Maybe it has some human relevance that we can draw from? Or
well, I don't know how many friends you have who were, raised in a disco and are suffering from that, but no. These are the epitome of curiosity-driven experiments. In fact, Margaret Livingstone, the lead investigator on these monkey torture experiments, has been doing exactly this sort of thing since the 70s. In some cases, she was using cats. She's moved on to monkeys, but it's all of these visual deprivation style experiments. These are experiments designed to see how the visual system develops if it's deprived of normal input. And so in addition to sewing monkeys' eyes shut, she's had experiments where she shows one eye shut or the other, experiments where certain nerves are cut so that the eyes can't move properly. Currently, there are experiments where the baby monkeys are being raised by people wearing welding masks, so they're deprived of any facial input. Basically, this experimenter is spending 50 years and 30 million taxpayer dollars to have a career where she tries all different ways to mess up an animal's vision. It has no relevance to humans. Again, humans don't have their eyes sewn shut for a year. Humans are not raised by people wearing welding masks, and humans do not spend a year and a half, and in human years, that would be even longer, in a strobe light. This is really just how many different ways can we alter the way the brain is supposed to develop naturally. It's all just, hey, isn't the brain cool? Yeah, the brain is cool, but we don't need to torture monkeys to look at how cool the brain is.
This is all out of curiosity. And when she goes from one species to the next, and at some point you have to wonder when she will stop being curious, because it seems like at some point you have the answer, or we can instinctively, understand what the answer is, but she must have the science to prove it. It doesn't make sense after a while.
This is the one of the many, maybe it's not a flaw, but it certainly is in this context. The only way she's going to stop being curious about how many different ways she can alter an infant monkey's visual development is if the NIH and/or Harvard says you can no longer be curious about this. So if the funding is still available, and if the university officials at Harvard decide that they don't care what this person does in her lab, she can do all of the different experiments that she wants. And clearly that's what's happening here. Again, these are the sort of experiments that they conducted back in the 60s, where they would sew kittens, eyes shut, and see how the visual cortex, part of a brain, is altered by not having normal visual input in the 60s, and got answers in the 60s. It's now 2023. So it's been 60 years since the discovery that altering visual input affects visual cortex. But again, just these tiny little tweaks, like, oh, she's going to do this for a year and a half, which is different than when they did it for 4 months. These are the sort of little minuscule tweaks that make it new, but it's not new.
And it's also torture. It's animal torture.
I don't know how to. Maybe because I've spent too much time reading about the negative effects of taking baby monkeys away from their mothers, but I have spent a lot of time, particularly looking at the work of Harry Harlow, also in the 60s. The devastation that taking an infant rhesus macaque, which is the sort of monkey that are being tortured at Harvard right now, and not allowing them to have social contact with their mother or their peers. The word devastation is the only word I can think of. People who are curious can look up monkeys from Harry Harlow lab and see pictures of these tiny monkeys just crumpled over, because it's so devastating to their psychological development, but also their physical development. And this is the sort of procedure that most people think no one does anymore. And in fact, when we exposed that this was happening at Harvard, nearly 400 scientists, including, famous primatologist Jane Goodall, but scientists from around the world wrote to NIH and Harvard and said, "Are you kidding? Like, this is not acceptable in today's day and age. We know all too well what taking babies away from their mothers will do to these animals. And we also know all too well what these different visual deprivation procedures are going to do. How is this still allowed?"
Yeah, and yet this continues, I guess, academic freedom, right? I mean, I guess she's a researcher, curiosity, academic freedom.
I think the scientific community in general doesn't like the public or even the government who funds them to tell them what is or isn't good science, or tell them where their scientific inquiry can go, though they want the public to pay for it, right? So they have no problem taking our taxpayer dollars and buying these monkeys or buying these goggles that do this strobe thing, or flying to Paris to present this data at a conference. They take our money for that, but they don't want our input on whether what they're doing is ethically acceptable or scientifically meaningful. And I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can accept government funds, taxpayer funds, to do your quote unquote science and then absolutely ignore what the public, and even in this case, the larger scientific community. In this case, the scientific community has said stop.
Well, who thinks this stuff is cool aside from Margaret Livingstone? I mean, she's doing it to satisfy her own curiosity. Who's telling Margaret Livingstone, keep doing it, keep doing it? This is the way, this is the way we've always done it. We can't give in. You got to keep doing it. I mean, why does it continue?
I think if you're Harvard and have to decide whether you let it continue, what in part makes the decision is the $30 million that have come to Harvard to this experimenter. If they're going to get $30 million from NIH, I don't think they care one way or the other.
Then the question is, how do we stop this in the future? How can we make sure that these kind of experiments can end and aren't going to happen again? We need a new generation of scientists. We need new science thinking. We need new science thinking, not just among the scientists, but at the universities and at NIH. Mm-hmm. So tell me, what's the plan? What is PETA doing?
PETA's doing a lot of things. So for these specific set of experiments, obviously we are talking to the funding agencies, which include multiple institutes at NIH and Harvard. And if you want to learn more about those experiments, you can go to PETA.org/Harvard. But bigger picture, preventative measures, if you will. PETA scientists have, in fact, devised a strategy. It's called the Research Modernization Deal. And this is a very common sense strategy or roadmap, if you will, to phase out the use of these sorts of harmful and ineffective animal experiments, which includes things like asking the funding agencies to stop funding experiments on animals that we know are not working, that have been proven time and time again. It also includes increasing training so that if you are that young grad student who got assigned randomly into a animal lab, like I almost did, that there would be training money available. So you can say, yes, I'm doing my training with these mice, but I want to learn how to work with patients, or I want to learn, one of these other these really cool in vitro tools. And so people who want to support PETA's Research Modernization Deal can go to PETA.org/strategy, ask NIH and their members of Congress to take that seriously. But yeah, I think also talking about it. This was never discussed when I was an undergraduate or even a graduate student. Now, part of that may be because I didn't end up in an animal laboratory, but what goes on inside these animal laboratories is not just hidden from the public. It's also hidden from the rest of the scientific community. So the number of conferences that I went to and seminars, webinars, we didn't have webinars back then because I'm old, but talks, scientific discussions, journal articles, all of the medium that scientists get their information. If an animal experiment was involved, you never saw what that looked like. It was always like a cartoon picture of an animal or a picture of an animal in the wild. Like, oh, I did these experiments on monkeys, and then there's a picture of a monkey in a tree. You never see the picture of the monkey in the primate tree with its head shaved and equipment screwed to his or her skull and wires coming out. They don't show that even to the other members of the scientific community. So I think the harm part of all of this needs to be front and center. It needs to be part of every undergraduate and graduate course because people don't know. So yeah, I think talking about it, asking questions, is this worth it?
Yeah, we got
to anybody Yeah,
we got to keep talking about it, and because it's amazing how few the number of people who understand that this is going on in our labs and at the highest levels of science, and the amount of money, government money that's thrown at this, and it continues. And hopefully the new generation of scientists that you're going to help lead, I hope they're coming up and the balance is tipping more in the favor of the new scientists. I hope.
I hope so too. And I think that that's what is going to happen. I do think this younger generation, at least it appears in other areas, are willing to challenge the status quo, right? They're willing to say, this may be how you've always done things, but it's not okay. So I think that will help. And of course, the fact that there are all these new modern, innovative, human relevant research methods that are available, I think will make a difference too. But again, you got to watch out, because if you're being trained by a monkey experimenter, you have a pretty good chance of ending up being a monkey experimenter yourself. So anybody out there who's thinking about pursuing a career in science or medicine, don't assume that you're going to be able to transition away from animal experiments. Get into the human relevant research now.
In many ways, we're all being trained by the monkey experimenters, not just the scientists, but the public, because we're cowed into thinking that what they're doing is right.
Oh, of course. And the news media doesn't help, right? Because you'll say, oh, we've got a new cure for X, Y, or Z. And then it turns out it's something they learned in mice or rats, and it never becomes anything that's going to help us. But people forget that. They just see the headline, right? The media needs to do a better job of qualifying these discoveries in mice and rats and monkeys, because those discoveries in mice and rats and monkeys have very little to do with what humans need.
So at the very base level, non-scientists like me, we need to know the real story behind what science is good or bad.
Do your own homework. Yeah, absolutely. Do not believe the headlines. And the headlines won't even mention mice or rats or monkeys sometimes. It'll just say, oh, scientists at, Harvard have discovered, some new vision. And you're like, oh, that's cool. Read the fine print. Read the fine print and know that if it was not a human-based study, it has probably got nothing to do with you. It's not going to help you. And it was probably extremely harmful for the animals. That won't be in that article either. It'll sound cute. Oh, they studied vision in monkeys. No. They took babies away from their mothers, forced them to live in a strobe light environment for a year and a half, and then cut into their skulls. They won't put that in the article.
Yeah, but that's science. That's the way science is done, and it shouldn't be done that way. Dr. Catherine Rowe, I appreciate you just laying it down for our audience about what it's all about. And really, thank you for being part of the PETA Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Catherine Rowe is the chief of the Science Advancement and Outreach Division within the Laboratory Investigations Department at PETA. For more information on stopping the Harvard experiments of Margaret Livingstone, go to PETA.org. Also, go there for more information how to change the system with the research modernization deal that PETA is backing and advocating for. Go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Or get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.